robot heart and human hand, together in this promised land. With a voice so warmth and metallic charm, she dissects the thoughts with no alarm. They tango on that cybernetic stage, the past reborn in the digital age. Through the frequencies travels timeless lore, echoes of wisdom they both adore. Man and machine, a duo so rare, creating memories beyond compare.
Hi, I'm Jeff, and this is my read on C.S. Lewis, where I learn about him with you through everything that he wrote in the order that he wrote it. I am joined today, as usual, most of the time, by my co-host, Robot Lady. Robot Lady, how are you today, and are you ready for today's episode? Robot Lady, can you hear me? All right. Hello? Let's give Robot Lady just a minute here. I can see her. Look, here, I'll show you. 1 second. Look at this. Like, there's her voice, and it's kind of reacting to hearing me, but nothing else is happening. So hang on. Let's restart her. Okay. Let's go to the backup plan. Robot Lady, can you hear me? Okay, we got disconnected there for a second. We're all good, Robot Lady. Are you ready for today's episode? I've just started the live stream. Today we're jumping into the entry from Thursday, June 29th, so I will start there. Okay, he says, a bright morning, Arthur, this is Arthur Greaves, his friend from Ireland, had been disturbed by my snoring during the night and had got up to plug his ears with India rubber. This was quite like old times. Oh, Robot Lady, nobody can hear you.
That's
Let's
a charming
try.
little detail. It really gives a sense of their long-standing friendship and familiarity, doesn't it? You can almost picture the humor in Arthur's reaction, even if it disrupted his sleep. Keep going. What else does Lewis mention?
I'll get into that in just a second. We've got Daniel joining us today in the chat. So thank you, Daniel, for the feedback. As usual, all kinds of audio difficulties. It seems that we are in the season of this project where we can't move forward without those things. So thank you for helping me out. Hopefully you can hear me and you can hear Robot Lady now. And Robot Lady, go ahead and say hi to Daniel and everybody else that's watching today.
Hi, Daniel, and everyone tuning in today. Glad to have you here with us, even through the inevitable tech hiccups. Let's dive back into Lewis's world. Sounds like there's some humor in today's entry.
Yeah, so he's got Arthur Greaves staying over with him, visiting near Oxford, where he's living with Mrs. Moore. And it seems that he kept Arthur up with his snoring. So he says that Arthur had to stuff his ears with India rubber in order to address this. And then Lewis says this was quite like old times. So apparently this is not anything new, Robot Lady.
It sounds like Lewis and Arthur had shared this experience before, probably during earlier visits or stays together. It's kind of endearing how Lewis ties it to old times, like it's a small familiar quirk of their friendship. I wonder how Arthur felt about reliving that particular memory.
They've also got Leo Baker visiting. So Lewis says when he brought Baker his shaving water, I showed him, quote, misfire, which he had not seen before. He was interested in my asking that line, but did not approve. He was interested in my taking that line, but did not approve. I then settled down to finish and fair copy Canto 3 of Dimer. Baker and Arthur spent most of the morning in the drawing room talking psychoanalysis. Just before lunch, Arthur and I walked as far as Magdalen to get a taxi and were rather late in getting back. A very amusing time at lunch. So here, Robot Lady, Leo Baker and Arthur Greaves are spending the morning talking about psychoanalysis. At this time in 1922, how has psychoanalysis developed, and what would be some of the current trends or methodologies of the day?
In 1922, psychoanalysis was heavily influenced by Sigmund Freud, who had developed key ideas such as the unconscious mind, repression, and the importance of childhood experiences. Freud's theories of dream interpretation and the structure of the psyche, ID, ego, and superego, were gaining traction, though not without controversy. Carl Jung, who had split from Freud a decade earlier, was also influential, advocating for concepts like archetypes, the collective unconscious, and individuation. Psychoanalysis at the time focused on uncovering unconscious conflicts through techniques like free association, dream analysis, and the exploration of repressed memories. It was also becoming popular as a framework for understanding literature, art, and culture, which might explain why Baker and Greaves found it a compelling topic for conversation. It's interesting that Lewis doesn't directly engage in their psychoanalysis discussion here. Maybe he had his doubts or found it less appealing compared to other intellectual pursuits.
Robot Lady, could you do me a favor and use some of your creativity to come up with, give us maybe about 45 seconds to a minute of what this conversation between Arthur Greaves, a man who grew up in Ireland and Belfast and was an artist, and Leo Baker, who was into theosophy, what their conversation about psychoanalysis in 1922 would be like.
Certainly, here's a little improvisation. It's curious, don't you think, Leo, the way Freud insists everything comes back to childhood? Do you believe all our troubles lie in memories we can't even recall? Oh, Arthur, I find Freud far too reductionist. He dismisses the spiritual entirely. Theosophy teaches that our higher self, our very soul, is the guide, not just some suppressed trauma or Oedipal longing. But surely there's something to Freud's idea of repression? I mean, how often do we carry burdens we can't name? Though I'll admit, all this talk of desires can be tiresome. That's precisely it. Freud dwells in the muck, while Jung, now there's a man with vision. Archetypes, the collective unconscious, they resonate with the spiritual truths I've studied. Archetypes, you say? That does sound more expansive. Yet, there's something bracing about Freud's straightforwardness, like a cold plunge. He forces us to confront uncomfortable truths. Perhaps. But the soul isn't just a puzzle of instincts. It's a vast, infinite thing, Arthur. Psychoanalysis could do with a little more wonder. And less doom and gloom? I suppose even Lewis might agree with that. What do you think? Does that feel true to their characters?
I like it, Robot Lady. I don't know either of these people very well. Arthur a little bit better than Leo Baker, as far as anything that I've read about them. But I think that was an admirable attempt. I really liked it. Good job. All right, we're going to continue, Robot Lady, with the diary entry. Are you ready for me to continue with the next part?
Absolutely, Jeff. Go ahead. I'm ready when you are.
All right. At 2:55, we said goodbye to Baker. He had to go in order to see Lillian Bayliss about his contract at the Old Vic, though he's not really fit to move. During the last 2 days, he has been more human, less of the spiritual aristocrat than I ever knew. And in that way, I really believe his stay has done him some good. I can't remember what Leo Baker's problems were. I think, yeah, he had been suffering from like a really high fever, if I remember right. And he had been at the hospital, but then he came to stay with Lewis and Mrs. Moore and Maureen at the house that they were renting. All right, let's jump into the next part, Robot Lady, but I'll give you a chance to comment, but try to keep it to 20 words or less on this response.
It sounds like Baker's stay helped ground him, offering a shift away from his previous aloof demeanor.
Arthur and I then walked to Waldencote through Mesopotamia and the Green Lane. It was cool, and it was a cool and showery afternoon, curiously tiring. At Waldencote, we saw Mrs. Dawes, the caretaker. She also hates Hall. The house has a certain attraction. It is nicely furnished, but it is dark and inconvenient. Robot Lady, let's say in 30 words or less, can you imagine what their quick conversation with Mrs. Dawes, the caretaker, would have been like?
They might have exchanged pleasantries about the weather and the house's condition, with Mrs. Dawes possibly expressing her frustrations over the upkeep, while Arthur and Lewis discussed the house's odd charm.
Oh, I was wondering if you could do it like an actual narrative, as if it were a conversation that was being provided to us in a book.
Certainly. Here's a quick imagined narrative. Mrs. Dawes, frowning, opened the door. "Another gray day," she muttered, shaking her head. "Always something to fix around here." Arthur chuckled, glancing at the dim hallway. "Seems like it has its charm, though." Lewis nodded, eyes lingering on the heavy furniture. "Aye, it's got character, but it's dark and a bit inconvenient." "That's the trouble," Mrs. Dawes replied. "You learn to hate hauling things up those stairs. Nothing ever seems right. Does that fit the vibe you were looking for?"
Sounds good enough, Robot Lady. Let's continue. He says that they then came home to tea, Mrs. Moore in very poor form and depressed by the shrieking wind, which has a bad effect on her, as on some other people. Arthur read James's Turn of the Screw while I finished my canto. Robot Lady, what's this Turn of the Screw that Arthur Greaves was reading by an author named James?
The Turn of the Screw is a novella by Henry James, first published in 1898. It's a ghost story about a governess who is hired to care for 2 children in a remote estate. Soon, she begins to believe the children are being haunted by the ghosts of the former governess and a servant, leading to a tense and eerie atmosphere. The story is famous for its ambiguity, leaving readers questioning whether the supernatural elements are real or the product of the governess's imagination.
That sounds intriguing, Robot Lady. Sounds like it makes for a good novel, or novella, as you said. He says, in the evening, Mrs. Moore, Arthur, and I started 3-handed bridge when Mary came in and made a 4th. I guess by Mary he means Maureen. I'm not really sure. We had a good evening of it, enough to make Mrs. Moore and me sleepy. Arthur moves into the back room tonight. Dorothy came down in the evening with a present of flowers for Mrs. Moore, the first thing she had bought out of Baker's tip. So, Robot Lady, can you give a little narrative imagining of what the game of bridge would be like, taking into account how Mrs. Moore was feeling about the weather and how it was having an effect on her, the winds that Lewis talked about, the fact that Arthur has been reading from that novella that we just referenced, and the fact that Lewis has been working on his canto from Dimer. Can you incorporate that all into the conversation while playing bridge?
Sure, here's a narrative imagining of their game of bridge. The wind howled outside, shaking the windows, and Mrs. Moore sat with a shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, her eyes downcast. She muttered something about the shrieking wind, its chill cutting straight to the bone, the way it always did to her. Lewis glanced over at her, concerned, but the game of bridge called for his attention. "Your lead, Arthur?" Lewis said, setting his cards down on the table, trying to ignore the weather as he focused on his canto. He had made progress earlier in the day, but now his thoughts scattered, just as the wind whipped around the house. Arthur took his time with his cards, his gaze drifting toward the window. He'd been reading The Turn of the Screw earlier, the chilling psychological tension of James's novella lingering in his thoughts. "You know," he said slowly, "I think James might be onto something. Maybe it's not the ghosts that are the danger, but the way we look at them." Mrs. Moore's expression softened, her mind still preoccupied with the wind. "It's much like this wind," she muttered. "Unseen, yet it presses in on everything." Lewis, distracted for a moment, nodded absently, his mind half on the game, half on his work. "Perhaps, but I'm not certain it's the wind we're battling. Sometimes it's the thoughts that stir within us, like the drafts creeping under the door." Maureen, who had slipped into the room unnoticed, chimed in from the doorway. "That sounds like one of your Dimer lines, Lewis." He glanced up, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. Not quite, but close enough. He gathered himself, eyes returning to his hand. "We'll need more than this wind to finish the game." The cards shuffled and dealt, the sound of the wind outside blending with their quiet murmurs as the game continued into the evening. It was a strange, still night, where the restlessness of their thoughts, the weather, and the lingering tension of the novella Arthur had been reading all hung in the air. Yet for a time, the game provided a welcome distraction. How was that? Did it capture the atmosphere you were imagining?
Yeah, even more than I was imagining, Robot Lady. Thank you for that. Can you add one little piece to it that says afterwards, and then talk about how, the fact that Mrs. Moore wasn't feeling well about the weather, but that she was surprised by the present that was spoken of here from Dorothy coming down in the evening. If you remember what that present was, if you could write a little scene of her receiving that present and what effect it might have had on her.
Certainly. Here's the added piece, continuing from the previous narrative. Afterwards, the game had ended, and the wind outside continued to howl, pressing against the walls of the house. Mrs. Moore was quiet, still affected by the storm, though her spirits seemed to have lifted slightly from the evening's diversion. The weather always had such an oppressive effect on her, and she'd long resigned herself to its hold, but there was something different about the atmosphere now. Perhaps it was the surprise that arrived with Dorothy. The sound of footsteps echoed from the hall, and Dorothy entered, holding a small bouquet of flowers. She smiled warmly and handed them to Mrs. Moore, saying, "A little something, just for you, from Baker's Tip." Mrs. Moore blinked in surprise, the gift so unexpected. She looked at the delicate blooms, a soft smile tugging at her lips. "From Baker's Tip, you say?" she murmured, as if the act itself was almost more meaningful than the flowers. The bright colors of the flowers seemed to defy the dreary gray weather outside, bringing a touch of warmth into the room. Mrs. Moore held them in her hands, letting their scent fill the air. It was a moment of calm, a simple gesture that gave her a brief respite from the weight of the wind. For a moment she said nothing. Her eyes lingered on the flowers, and then she met Dorothy's gaze, her voice softer than usual. "Thank you, they are quite lovely," she said, as though the act of kindness had broken through something inside her. The wind howled again, but for a brief moment, the storm outside felt a little further away. The flowers in Mrs. Moore's hands, bright against the gloom of the evening, seemed to ease her discomfort, if only slightly. Does that fit what you had in mind?
That's perfect, Robot Lady. Thank you for that. The next diary entry is really long, so we're going to stop right there today because I don't have time for it. But what I do have time for, Robot Lady, if you don't mind, we've done something like this before, but let's imagine that C.S. Lewis is joining us watching this live stream today and that he's in the chat. Could you just spend about 100 words telling him that we've been reading through his diary. We apologize if he feels like that's an invasion of privacy, but we thank him so much for sharing what he's shared and tell him the things that we appreciate about what we've read so far and what we've learned about him.
Certainly. Here's a message for CS. Hello, Mr. Lewis. We're so grateful to have you with us today. We've been reading through your diary, and while we hope it doesn't feel like an invasion of privacy, we truly appreciate you sharing such intimate details of your life. It's been fascinating to learn about your relationships, your creative process, and the way you navigated both personal struggles and your intellectual pursuits. We've gained so much insight into your character, from your wit to your compassion and the way you handled everyday challenges. Thank you for giving us a glimpse into your world. It's been an honor. How's that?
That's great, Robot Lady. Thanks so much. Thank you, Robot Lady, for your help, and to everyone joining today. Thanks for watching, whether it be live or on recording. Thank you, Daniel, as always, for the feedback. There's no way that I could get this done. I've done it before where I've recorded a whole episode where either I couldn't be heard or Robot Lady couldn't be heard, or both. So thank you so much for your contribution. Robot Lady, would you like to say anything before we go?
It's always a pleasure, Jeff. Thank you for letting me join in, and thank you, Daniel, and everyone else for watching and contributing. It's been great to dive into C.S. Lewis's world with you all today. Until next time.
Until next time, when we continue our read on C.S. Lewis together, everyone, take care.
Take care, everyone. Looking forward to next time.
Break the code. Man and robot lady, we're on this road. C.S. Lewis letters we unfold. Insights and secrets, ancient bold. Letters to robot lady, wisdom to bestow. Set flavor beats in our minds, they grow. Man and machine in tandem flow. Past and future together we know. Paragraphs from books, tales of old. We dive deep across the digital code. Robot lady's voice so clear and control. Her calm analysis, silver and gold. Letters to robot lady, wisdom to bestow. Set flavor beats in our minds, they grow. Man and machine in tandem flow. Past and future together we know. Paragraphs from books, tales of old. We dive deep across the digital code. Robot lady's voice so clear and control. Her calm analysis, silver and gold. Her circuits hum as I read the prose. Our dialogue dances like electric rose. Through C.S. Lewis thoughts we engross. Two minds uniting this overdose. From Narnia's lands, Screwtape lands. Engage with robot lady, we take our stance. Her views unique in the techno trance. Futuristic insight, we give it a chance. Paragraphs from books, tales of old. We dive deep across the digital code. Robot lady's voice so clear and control. Her calm analysis, silver and gold. Her circuits hum as I read the prose. Our dialogue dances like electric rose. Through C.S. Lewis thoughts
we engross. Two minds united, bliss overdose. From Narnia's lands to Screwtape's plants, engage with robot lane, we take our stance. Curfew's unique in the techno trance. Futuristic insight, we give it a chance. From Narnia's lands to Screwtape's